For decades, whispers haunted the palace corridors, but no one expected King Charles to finally break down and admit the unthinkable, a secret child hidden from the world. This moment would shatter the royal image forever. The cameras had been rolling for hours, the crowd buzzing with polite anticipation, expecting nothing more than another ceremonial speech from a man long trained to speak without revealing anything at all. But when Charles stepped to the podium that evening, something was different. The confidence usually painted across his face had vanished, replaced by a visible trembling in his hands and an uneasy flicker in his eyes. His nervous demeanor sent waves of confusion rippling through the crowd, and those closest to him exchanged glances. Something was coming. Something none of them had prepared for. He gripped the edges of the podium, knuckles white, and for a long, harrowing moment, he didn't speak. The camera zoomed in, and the silence became deafening. Then, as if betraying the walls of composure he'd built his entire life, a single tear slipped down his cheek before he uttered even a word. The press caught it immediately, and gasps echoed through the hall. This was no ordinary royal speech. Finally, his voice cracked the silence, a quiver lacing every syllable. "There is something I've hidden." He paused, breathing heavily, his gaze sweeping the crowd as if searching for someone or something to give him strength. "From the world, and from you all." The air seemed to thicken in the room, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone present. Audiences around the globe watched, frozen. Royal advisors in the wings stiffened, their faces drained of color. The stunned silence of the audience gave way to an audible gasp as the next words left his mouth, words that would ring in every corner of the nation, words that would unravel decades of tightly guarded secrecy. "I have a child who has lived in the shadows all this time." The crowd erupted into chaos, murmurs, gasps, some even rising to their feet in shock. Journalists scrambled, shouting questions that Charles, eyes still glistening, ignored entirely. But the bombshell was only the beginning. Behind this child lay a web of deceit, betrayal, and an untold love story that threatened the monarchy's very foundation. Every secret has a beginning. And this one began with a forbidden love so powerful it nearly destroyed the crown. Long before he stood weeping before the world, Charles was just a young man suffocating under the relentless weight of expectation. His days were rigid, his nights cold, and though he carried himself like the heir he was groomed to be, inside he was fractured, lonely, restless, and desperate for something real. In those years, behind closed doors, he often spoke of feeling like a prisoner in a golden cage, yearning for even a glimpse of authentic connection. And then, almost by accident, he met her. She was nothing like the women paraded before him by his advisors. No noble lineage, no carefully polished manners to fit palace protocol. She came from a world far removed from gilded halls, yet she carried herself with a quiet confidence that disarmed him completely. From their very first meeting, she stirred something in him he hadn't known was possible. Laughter that wasn't rehearsed, conversations that weren't scripted, and feelings that left him both terrified and alive. Their romance began in shadows. A fragile flame protected from the storm of scrutiny, waiting just beyond the palace gates. In secret, he would slip away, inventing errands or duties, all to steal moments with her, moments he would later call his only taste of real happiness. The rigid walls of duty crumbled each time she looked at him like he was a man, not a monarch in waiting. But secrecy came at a cost. The more intense their bond grew, the more dangerous it became. Charles, never one for recklessness, began taking greater risks just to see her, dodging the eyes of palace guards, weaving lies into his schedule, and sneaking away to quiet cottages where no one would think to look. He wrote her letters full of longing, letters he never dared keep, but which she cherished in secret. For a time, they believed foolishly, perhaps, that they could exist in their own private world forever. But the machinery of the monarchy never sleeps. Whispers began to reach the ears of palace aides, whispers that turned to investigations. And then, one bitter evening, their sanctuary was shattered. Advisors confronted him, their tones a mix of fury and fear, warning of disgrace, scandal, and the possible destruction of everything he had been born to uphold. They ordered him to end it, to forget her, to destroy every trace. And while his outward compliance gave them relief, in his heart he vowed never to let go entirely. Yet what no aide or advisor could erase was the legacy their love left behind, the child who became the crown's greatest secret. The child who bore the blood of a king, yet lived as a stranger, hidden, denied, and erased from history. When their love was discovered, the woman vanished almost overnight, spirited away by palace handlers to a remote and nameless village. Her quiet pregnancy unfolded far from public scrutiny, wrapped in a silence so absolute it was, as if she no longer existed. Every doctor's visit was arranged in secret, every appointment coded and concealed, while she carried within her the air no one dared acknowledge. The monarchy's survival depended on her discretion, and she bore that burden with quiet resilience. When the child was finally born, there was no fanfare, no grand announcement, only more silence. The birth, though monumental in its implications, was treated as a liability rather than a blessing. Within hours of the delivery, palace operatives arrived, signing papers, issuing stern warnings, and arranging for the infant to be whisked into anonymity. No record would ever officially bear the child's connection to Charles. The corridors of power remained unshaken, while one of its own was relegated to the shadows. And yet, even then, something in Charles would not let go. Despite the suffocating weight of royal duty and the relentless pressure to erase this chapter of his life, he could not completely sever the bond. On quiet nights, when the world believed he was resting in his quarters, he would quietly slip away. Disguised and guarded, he would visit, standing in the shadows to watch his child sleep, unable to speak, unable to hold them, but unable to stay away. The child grew up in this strange limbo, a life of modest comfort yet inexplicable distance, always sensing that something about them was different. They felt it in the way strangers stared too long at their features, in the way their mother would sometimes grow quiet when they asked about their father, and in the whispers that followed them at school and in the streets. There was always a sense of something unspoken, something simmering beneath the surface. Over the years, the palace continued to send money to the mother, disguised through various trusts and accounts to keep her and the child quiet. It was enough to keep them housed, clothed, and away from prying eyes, but never enough to quiet the questions. Even within the palace, there were whispers. Among the staff, hushed conversations about the other heir surfaced from time to time, quickly silenced by threats and fear of dismissal. Those who knew too much were reassigned, and those who dared speak too loudly were removed entirely. The child's existence became the monarchy's deepest secret, a name never spoken but always lingering like a ghost over the crown. But even the most carefully hidden secret can't stay buried forever, especially when the child begins to ask dangerous questions. When you feel the truth coursing through your veins, no lie can keep you down, and the secret heir finally demands answers. For years, they had carried the weight of unspoken questions, subtle hints, and quiet betrayals. But as adulthood set in, the veil began to lift. They started noticing how neighbors would glance too long at them, how certain doors were closed just as they approached. Old photographs tucked away in drawers revealed a young Charles standing near their mother, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder, a look of intimacy neither parent could explain away. The handwriting in forgotten letters, the strange visits from well-dressed strangers who left envelopes full of cash and warnings, and the odd, fleeting mentions from people who quickly corrected themselves all coalesced into a single, undeniable conclusion. One evening, in a moment of quiet rebellion, they went digging through their mother's things. Beneath layers of clothes and keepsakes, they found a folder sealed and hidden at the bottom of an old chest. Inside, brittle letters from Charles himself, full of longing and guilt, promises of care without acknowledgement. There were photos that had never been seen before, stolen snapshots of him standing over a crib, watching from the shadows, visiting under cover of night. The next morning, they confronted their mother. She tried, at first, to deny it, to protect him, to keep the fragile illusion intact. But when pressed, when the words, "Stop lying to me, I know who he is," broke from their lips, she crumbled. Through tears, she confessed everything. How she had once loved him, how the palace had threatened her, how she was forced to live in silence so her child would not suffer the same scrutiny she had endured. The heir's fury was immediate and unrelenting. Years of stolen identity, of never knowing who they truly were, of being denied their place in the world, came crashing down at once. They felt betrayed not only by Charles but by their own mother for allowing it to happen, and that anger lit a fire they could no longer extinguish. Fueled by heartbreak and defiance, they made their move, demanding a meeting with palace officials and delivering an ultimatum. If Charles refused to acknowledge them publicly, they would go to the press themselves. The palace, once so confident in its ability to control the narrative, descended into panic. Senior advisors scrambled behind closed doors, drafting contingency plans, calling in favors, desperate to quash the story before it erupted into a full-blown scandal. Yet no amount of maneuvering could reverse what had already begun. The truth had become a living, breathing force that no threat could silence, and the heir stood ready to bring the monarchy to its knees if denied again. But what drove Charles to finally confess wasn't just the threat, it was the pain of his own conscience and a shocking turn of events. It wasn't just pressure, it was tragedy, betrayal, and heartbreak that forced Charles to crack. When the heir's ultimatum went unanswered, they acted decisively. In secret, they began reaching out to senior journalists known for uncovering royal scandals. Late-night calls and anonymous meetings in quiet corners of London laid the groundwork for an exposé that would detonate like a bomb across the monarchy. Details of their lineage, the suppressed photographs, the letters, all of it, ready to be printed. Within days, a tabloid had already prepared a front-page story headlined, "The King's Hidden Child," and word of the impending revelation trickled back to palace corridors, igniting panic. But that was only the beginning of the nightmare. As Charles tried desperately to buy time, he made another chilling discovery, a betrayal far closer to home. Key aides, trusted advisors he'd known for decades, had secretly plotted to ensure the heir would never come forward. Documents revealed they'd diverted funds meant to support the heir, smeared the mother's name in whispers, and even attempted to push the heir abroad permanently. For years, they had sabotaged every attempt Charles made to discreetly stay connected, ensuring that the child remained a stranger. The revelation shattered him. And then came the final blow. The heir, after weeks of emotional strain, collapsed and was hospitalized for what doctors described as a breakdown. The news reached Charles in the middle of the night, and it was said that he broke down himself upon hearing it, overcome with guilt that his silence had driven his own blood to the edge. As the palace scrambled to contain the brewing storm, Camilla's reaction only deepened the fracture. Furious and humiliated, she allegedly stormed out of their quarters, calling the heir's existence a disgrace, and warning that public acknowledgement would destroy everything they had built. Her harsh words reportedly left Charles speechless, torn between the woman who shared his throne and the child who carried his blood. That night, he sat alone in his private chambers, staring at the headlines that were about to tear through the kingdom. The walls of duty, silence, and denial he had constructed so carefully over the decades now pressed against him like a cage. For once, he realized he could no longer serve both masters, the crown and his conscience. And so he stood before the world, tears staining his face, to tell a truth that would change history. But the aftermath was even more explosive. When the king admitted his secret, the palace descended into chaos, factions forming and loyalties tested to the breaking point. The moment Charles spoke those words to the world, the gilded calm of the monarchy shattered into pieces. Senior royals, blindsided and humiliated, erupted behind closed doors. Some accused him of betraying the crown and dishonoring their lineage, their fury echoing through corridors where whispers turned to shouts. Others, stunned into silence, could do little more than glare, as though the very air had betrayed them. Their polished masks of unity crumbled, revealing cracks that had always lurked beneath the surface. Palace aides scrambled to craft a narrative that could salvage the institution's dignity. They drafted statements, called in allies, and deployed familiar phrases like privacy, duty, and dignity. But this time, none of it worked. The press was already running wild, headlines screaming of betrayal, secret bloodlines, and palace conspiracies. No amount of controlled language could keep pace with the storm that Charles had unleashed. Inside the palace, Queen Camilla allegedly locked herself away in her private chambers, refusing to speak to anyone, even Charles. Those who caught brief glimpses of her said her expression was one of disgust and rage, and some overheard her calling the heir's existence an unforgivable humiliation. In her silence, the tension only thickened, and even the most seasoned staff avoided her door. Then came the confrontation Charles had dreaded most of his sons. William and Harry arrived in haste, their faces taut with emotion. What was meant to be a private meeting quickly turned bitter. William's voice reportedly rose above the others, demanding to know how his father could keep such a monumental secret from his own family, accusing him of weakening the monarchy at its core. Harry, though quieter, was said to have stared at his father with a mixture of hurt and disbelief, his silence more damning than words. Charles stood there, facing his sons, his shoulders heavy with shame and defiance alike, torn between explaining himself and admitting there was no defense. Outside the palace gates, the public reaction was just as divided. Crowds gathered some holding signs, demanding Charles step aside, others chanting their support, claiming the heir deserved their rightful place. Cheers and protests clashed in the streets. A nation torn between loyalty to the crown and sympathy for the child who had lived so long in the shadows. Political figures entered the fray, questioning whether a king capable of hiding such a scandal was fit to reign. Parliament debated his judgment, his advisors whispered about abdication, and the air in London thickened with a sense of impending collapse. Yet amid the chaos, a new question emerged. What would become of the heir, and could they claim a place in the royal line? The secret heir, emboldened by the king's confession, stepped forward not to hide anymore, but to claim what was rightfully theirs. In the hours that followed Charles's emotional address, the heir emerged from the shadows and addressed the nation with a voice that shook even the most steadfast doubters. Standing before a bank of microphones, their words rang out like a clarion call. "I am the blood of a king." The phrase alone sent shockwaves across the kingdom, undeniable, unapologetic, and impossible to ignore. Crowds gathered outside the palace almost immediately. Some came to cheer, waving banners and shouting support for the heir's courage. Others jeered, outraged that such a claim could threaten centuries of tradition and taint the sanctity of the throne. Police cordoned off the area, but emotions ran high, spilling into streets already heavy with tension. Those who had once stood shoulder to shoulder in loyalty to the crown now found themselves divided by a single, unignorable truth. In newspapers and on airwaves, legal scholars began to weigh in, dissecting every possible scenario. Could the heir, born in secrecy and outside the confines of marriage, lay claim to royal titles? Could they even enter the line of succession? The law offered no clear answers. Some argued it was a matter of blood and nothing more. Others insisted the scandal disqualified them forever. But for the first time in living memory, the monarchy's rules and the public's allegiance felt frighteningly fragile. Behind palace walls, the atmosphere turned toxic. Charles's advisors pressed him relentlessly to act, to silence the heir, to issue a legal challenge, anything to restore order. Meetings stretched late into the night, voices raised, papers slammed onto tables. But every argument only drove Charles deeper into turmoil, his face pale with indecision. And then came Camilla's voice, sharper, colder than all the others. Those present would later claim she didn't merely urge him, but demanded that he cut ties completely, calling the heir an embarrassment that should have been left buried. Her fury left the room in stunned silence, yet Charles said nothing, his mind elsewhere. Later that evening, the heir issued one final, heart-wrenching plea. In another statement, their voice broke as they declared, "All I ever wanted was to be acknowledged. Not power, not wealth, just a place in my father's heart and in this family." Those words, so simple yet so loaded, left even Charles's staunchest defenders shaken. But the heir's demand would lead to an unexpected confrontation, one that would test Charles more than ever before. It all came down to one fateful meeting, father and child face to face, with the crown hanging in the balance. When the palace finally summoned the heir, it was not to another press statement or legal briefing, but to a private meeting inside the heart of royal power. Guards lined the halls in silence, their eyes avoiding both as they passed, and even the air in the room seemed charged with something unspoken. Charles stood waiting when the heir arrived, his usual regal composure already cracking under the weight of what was to come. The tension was palpable, a lifetime of silence collapsing between them. And then, almost without warning, Charles broke. His voice faltered, his body shook, and in front of the heir who had fought so long to be seen, he finally fell to his knees and wept. The tears he had hidden from the world flowed freely now, as though every year of denial and guilt had gathered into this one impossible moment. The heir stood frozen, watching their father the king stripped bare of pride and power. And then, for the first time, Charles reached out and embraced them. But the heir did not bow. Even as Charles clung to them with a desperation that stunned even himself, they stood tall, their voice calm but unyielding. They told him plainly that they would never again accept being sidelined, never again endure being treated as a shadow to his crown. Their blood demanded more than pity or secrecy, it demanded acknowledgement. Charles pulled back, staring into the eyes that mirrored his own, and for once, he didn't try to argue. Instead, he confessed what he had never dared say aloud, that he had been weak, that he had been terrified of the repercussions of the press, the advisors, the queen, the monarchy itself, that every decision he'd made to suppress the truth was born of fear, not malice, but fear all the same. And yet, in his attempt to protect the crown, he had wounded the very thing that could have made it whole. What followed was a silence so heavy, it seemed to seep into the stone walls around them. The air's resolve softened, though it did not break. For the first time, they and Charles truly looked at each other, not as sovereign and subject, but as father and child, and in that quiet recognition lay a raw, painful tenderness that left even the staff who witnessed it shaken. And then, with a voice that cracked under the weight of both love and regret, Charles spoke one final, cryptic truth. "You've always been my greatest secret, and my deepest shame." But what would happen next, and how the monarchy would recover, remained a question hanging heavy over the kingdom. With the truth revealed, the monarchy stood at a crossroads, and the future of the crown had never felt so uncertain. In the days that followed the final confrontation, the kingdom itself seemed to hold its breath. Streets were filled with heated debates, families torn between admiration and outrage. Some hailed the heir as a symbol of courage, the rightful embodiment of a more honest, human monarchy. Others denounced them as a stain on royal dignity, a scandal that threatened to undo centuries of tradition. The air buzzed with arguments over loyalty and betrayal, and the once unshakable foundation of the crown began to feel perilously fragile. Speculations swirled around Charles himself. Would he abdicate in shame? Could he remain king after such a public reckoning? Newspapers ran editorials demanding he step aside for William, while others defended him as a man who had finally faced his truth. Behind palace walls, whispers grew louder by the hour, and even loyal courtiers questioned whether the monarchy could survive this storm intact. Rumors also began to circulate about Camilla's intentions. Some claimed she was already seeking refuge elsewhere, unwilling to stand beside a king tarnished by scandal. Others suggested she had retreated into silence, biding her time, calculating how to reassert control once the dust settled. Whatever her plan, one thing was clear. The fracture between her and Charles had deepened beyond repair. Even William and Harry, so often united by their shared grief and brotherhood, found themselves divided over what to do next. William was said to have argued for swift action to preserve the institution, demanding the heir be kept at a distance to avoid further damage. Harry, meanwhile, reportedly urged his father to embrace the heir fully and heal the wounds that had festered for too long. Their opposing visions reflected the larger divide in the nation itself, between those who clung to the old ways and those who yearned for change. And then, as though to write the final line of this chapter himself, the heir was seen leaving the palace. Their heads held high, shoulders squared, they walked into a crowd that parted like a sea of conflicting emotions. There was no crown upon their head, but there was a quiet defiance in their stride, a silent vow that their story was far from over. And so, the question lingered like a shadow over every gilded hall and crowded street. Had the monarchy's greatest strength and its secrecy now become its greatest downfall? As the cameras faded and the palace doors closed, one truth remained. Nothing would ever be the same again. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.